I remember the fog more than anything else. It hung in the trees like a living thing, curling around the branches and swallowing the stars until the night sky became a blank canvas. The swamp was quiet, so still that every sound seemed unnatural. The drip of water, the rustle of reeds, the slow groan of wood settling in the distance. My lantern gave off a pale glow, not enough to see where the path ended, only enough to remind me how endless the darkness felt beyond its reach. There was no wind, no insects, nothing. Only the sound of my own footsteps pressing into the damp earth, leaving behind tracks that the fog was quick to claim. I told myself I was alone, but the truth pressed against me from the trees. Like something unseen was matching my pace, breathing when I breathed, waiting for me to slip deeper into the swamp's throat. The air was heavy, thick, almost humming with something I couldn't name. I tried not to look at the shadows, tried not to notice how they stretched too far, how they seemed to bend toward me when I passed. I thought it was just my mind. I thought it was just the swamp, but then I heard the water move, as if something had stepped in just behind me. That's when I saw it. The swamp was quiet except for the soft rustle of reeds brushing against each other. Mist lay thick over the water, clinging to my boots as I stepped carefully, sinking into the soft mud. Night had settled fully, though the moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds. Cold seeped through my coat, and the air smelled damp, like earth after rain mixed with something older. I stumbled over a root, my hand landing against something hard. A lantern. It was old, worn metal dulled by time, but the flame inside burned pale and steady. No oil, no wick, at least none I could see. The light was soft, almost fragile, but it reached far enough to push the dark back from the path ahead. I picked it up, surprised by how warm it felt, like it had been waiting. The swamp seemed to lean closer. Shadows shifted among the trees, shapes that weren't quite branches, not quite birds. Every time the lantern flickered, my own courage wavered. A shiver ran down my spine. Yet as long as the flame held, I felt safer. Safer, though I knew it wasn't real safety. The further I walked, the more I noticed small things out of place. A twig that snapped behind me, but when I turned, nothing stood there. A ripple in the water where no wind blew. The lantern's pale glow pressed back the blackness, but only just. And I realized then the flame wasn't mine to control. It had its own will. Hours or maybe minutes passed. Time was different here, stretched and slow. The swamp seemed alive, listening. I dared not breathe too loudly, not because I thought it would hear me, but because I felt that something in the dark was already aware of me. Then the flame shivered. A tiny sputter, almost imperceptible, and my hands trembled. Cold sweat gathered at my temples. The shadows edged closer. I whispered to the lantern, a foolish prayer I knew wouldn't be answered. Stay. Just stay. It steadied again, soft and unwavering. I breathed, long and shallow, and kept moving, each step heavier than the last. The mud sucked at my boots, each imprint a reminder that I was not alone here. Something shifted behind me. A wet rustle, the kind that slides across water and reed. I froze. The lantern flared, pale as bone, and for a second I saw shapes. Too dark to be animals, too crooked to be human. They lingered at the edge of light just beyond the circle where the flame could reach. I thought about dropping the lantern, running blindly, letting the dark claim me. But the second the thought crossed my mind, the darkness pressed forward like a tide. I gripped the lantern tighter. Its warmth seeped through my fingers, a fragile defiance against the swamp. Hours passed, or maybe only heartbeats. The pale light became a rhythm I could trust. Every flicker a warning, every steady glow a promise. As long as it burned, I could keep moving. I followed the path of shadows and mist, drawn deeper into the swamp's quiet, watching eyes. At some point, I stopped trying to see it all. I let the lantern's light guide me, not my eyes. I let the soft, steady hum of its flame fill the emptiness. And I realized the swamp wasn't waiting for me to leave. It was waiting for the flame to die. The flame sputtered again. A small hiccup of light and my stomach turned cold. I whispered again, softly, almost hoping it wouldn't hear me. Don't go out. And it didn't. I walked on, lantern in hand, each step a careful negotiation with fear. Every shadow seemed alive now, breathing just beyond the circle of light. And I wondered if the flame ever did die, if the darkness would swallow me whole, or if it had been here all along, simply waiting for me to notice. By the time the first gray hints of dawn began to touch the mist, the lantern still burned. Pale, unshakable, a small, quiet rebellion against the swamp's endless dark. I never knew how it worked. I never knew why it stayed lit. Only that for a few hours in that wet, whispering marsh, the world was mine again. And that was enough. Mist hung low over the marsh, curling between the reeds like pale smoke. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mud and decaying plants. I had wandered farther than I intended, drawn by the rhythm of the swamp, the quiet pulse of life, or something like life, beneath the surface. Then I heard it. A cry. Far away, stretched thin and hollow. Human but not human. It was a sound that made my chest tighten, that made the hairs along my arms rise. I paused. The reeds whispered around me as the cry echoed, long and mournful. It came again. I felt it, vibrating through the soles of my boots, through the fog that clung to my skin. I followed. The path was uncertain, water pooling in shallow depressions, reeds clutching at my coat. The cry pulled me forward, deeper into the marsh, and every step made the sound stretch and warp, as though the swamp itself were reshaping it. I thought I might reach someone in need. But the reeds stretched endlessly, bending and shifting with the fog, and then it answered. From behind. The same hollow call, but closer. The air between my shoulders prickled, and the hair on my neck bristled. I spun around, lantern held high. The pale light trembled, glinting on reeds slick with water. Nothing. The fog pressed in closer, thick and suffocating. The cry came again, both in front and behind, echoing as if the marsh had grown a mouth. I tried to call back. My voice sounded small, swallowed immediately by the damp air. The reeds seemed alive now. They whispered when I passed, brushing against my face with wet fingers. The sound came again, impossibly near, and for a moment I swore I saw shapes moving inside the fog. Fingers of shadow that weren't trees, that weren't any animal I knew. I stumbled through the mud, boots sinking. The cry pulsed, dragging me forward and back, like tides against my chest. I wanted to stop, to sink into the mud and hide, but the sound would not let me. It was patient. It knew I could not resist following. My lantern flickered. The pale flame sputtered against the fog. Cold wind rose, carrying the cry over the water, across the reeds, twisting into something sharper, more urgent. I shivered, clutching the lantern. I had been here alone, yes, but I had never felt so watched, so pursued by emptiness. The cry came again, answering every instinct that told me to turn back. And then I realized the cry wasn't asking me to follow. It was marking me. Every step I took, it mirrored me. Every glance behind, it was there. And no matter how far I went, it remained both ahead and behind. The swamp seemed infinite. Every reed I parted only revealed more, taller, darker, whispering as I passed. The water shone faintly in the lantern's glow, reflecting shapes that should not exist. I could not tell if I was moving forward or if the marsh was moving around me. I tried to shout, to call the cry by name, to demand silence. But my voice was swallowed by the fog, leaving only the sound behind me, stretching thinner, longer, hollower than before. I turned again. The reeds seemed to close in. Every stalk pressed against me, wet and slick, bending like hands trying to hold me back. The cry answered again, behind me, closer, and I felt the shape of it in the air. A cold brush, a presence that moved with me, matching my steps. I stumbled forward blindly, the lantern shaking, sputtering. The glow wavered over the water, and for a heartbeat I saw a face. Too thin, too long, too empty, then gone. By the time the fog thinned slightly at dawn, the cry faded into something small, distant, almost like a whisper. But I felt it still, lingering in the marrow of my bones. And I knew the marsh had learned my shape. It had mapped me in silence. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe too loudly. I only walked, letting the water swallow my footprints, letting the reeds bend back into their endless maze. And every so often I swore I heard it, my name twisted into the cry, soft, hollow, impossible to ignore. I kept moving, and I knew the marsh would keep listening. The swamp was heavy with morning fog, clinging to my coat and boots. Every step pressed the mud beneath me, soft and unyielding, swallowing my prints almost as soon as I made them. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting leaves, the kind of smell that sticks to your skin. I crouched beside the water, looking for a safe path when I saw them. Footprints, deep, wide, pressed into the muck as if something enormous had walked here. I frowned, brushing mud from my fingers. They weren't human. They weren't animal. And yet somehow they were familiar, like something that shouldn't exist had been here. The prints were fresh. The mud around them still trembled slightly. Small ripples, as if the swamp itself remembered the weight that had passed. I traced them with my eyes, following their path. They led away from the water into the reeds, then vanished. And I could not tell if I was relieved or more afraid. By evening, I realized they were back. Not just along the path I had followed, but near my campsite, circling the small fire I had lit. Wide, unnatural prints, pressed deep into the mud. Every time I moved, they seemed to shift, rearranging themselves, growing closer, enclosing me. The wind picked up, carrying a rustling that was neither leaves nor animal. I could hear soft squelches, wet and deliberate, as if something moved just out of sight. The swamp seemed alive, waiting, watching, every shadow sharper than the last. I traced the prints again, running my fingers along the wet edges. The shape was wrong. Too wide, too long, with curves that made no sense for a foot. I pressed my palms into the mud and compared. Nothing matched. Nothing could. The night came slowly. I stayed close to my fire, clutching my lantern, its pale flame flickering in the heavy air. Every crack of a twig, every distant splash made me tense, holding my breath. The prints around the camp seemed to shift with the firelight. Longer, wider, moving slightly in the corners of my eyes. I tried to convince myself it was the swamp playing tricks, mist curling over the reeds, water reflecting shadows strangely. But I could not shake the feeling that the footprints were waiting for something, or someone. Hours passed. I dared not leave the fire, dared not step into the mud beyond the immediate circle of light. The prints pressed closer, encircling me completely. I felt their presence in the soles of my boots, in the ache of my knees as I sat. They were patient. They did not hurry. They did not need to. The wind carried a sound then, faint at first, almost drowned by the swamp. A wet, dragging noise, deliberate, circling, matching the pattern of the prints. I froze, staring at the shadows among the reeds. Nothing. Only the soft tremble of the swamp, as if it breathed in time with me. I tried to move, to stand, but the ground seemed to resist. The mud clung to my boots, the reeds brushing my arms like fingers. Every direction I looked, the prints were there, wider, deeper, shaping the world around me into a cage. I whispered to myself, softly, not daring to raise my voice. This is just mud. Just prints, nothing more. The words felt hollow, even to me. I could feel the swamp leaning in, listening. When I finally closed my eyes, exhaustion dragging me down, I felt it. A pressure in the ground beneath me, something immense pressing just below the surface. The prints had not only surrounded me, they had settled in. They waited, silent, patient, unyielding. By dawn, the first pale light seeped into the fog. I opened my eyes. The prints were still there, encircling my fire, my camp, each imprint perfectly preserved in the soft, trembling mud. But there was something more, tiny ripples across the water, a wet shimmer that did not belong to wind or bird. The swamp was alive, and whatever had made the prints had not left. I packed quickly, leaving the fire to die. Each step pulled at me, the mud reluctant to let me go. But I did not look back. I could feel them there, following silently, tracing the shape of me in the muck. And I knew without doubt that by morning I would see them again. The swamp does not forget. It keeps its weight, its memory, its patience. And the prints, deep-wide, wrong remain. waiting for the next traveler who dares step into their embrace. The fog thickened as I moved through the swamp, curling around my boots, weaving through the reeds. The air smelled damp, mossy, and faintly of smoke, though no fire burned nearby. Shadows stretched long, twisted by the pale light of my lantern. Every step pressed into the mud, sucking at my soles, holding me back as if the swamp wanted me to pause, to notice. And then I saw it, a cabin, wooden, small, oddly perfect. It stood alone in the fog, windows clear and intact. But there were no doors, no way in, no way out if it wanted to trap me. I slowed, my lantern raised, the flame flickering as the mist wrapped around me. I walked closer, my boots sinking softly into the wet earth. The cabin did not creak or groan. It was still, perfectly still. I peered into the nearest window. Shadows moved inside, not like the play of the wind on walls or trees, but shapes shifting, slow, deliberate, like someone or something was pacing, waiting. I blinked. The shapes froze as if aware of my gaze. Then they moved again, fluid and silent, impossible to identify. The air felt heavier. Each breath came slow, wet with mist. I could smell the damp wood, the faint trace of something older. Older than me, older than the swamp. I stepped closer. I wanted to call out, to demand to know what was inside, but my voice died before it left my throat. The cabin had no doors, yet I could sense it listening. Its silence pressed against my ears, filled the space between the reeds, the mud, the fog. I circled it, lantern swinging, trying to see the back, the sides, anything. The shadows mirrored my movement, shifting as I moved, always staying just inside the glass. I could not tell if I was observing them or if they were observing me. A sudden rustle of leaves behind me made my stomach drop. I whirled, lantern swinging, but the fog held only shapes that might have been trees, might have been something else. When I looked back, the cabin remained the same, windows dark, but the movement inside persistent. No doors, no escape. I crouched, trying to see through another window. The shadows now seemed to lean toward the glass, pale fingers or limbs, pressing just at the edges of the frame. I could not make them out, could not tell if they were human or not, and the not knowing made my chest tighten. The mist outside the cabin thickened, rolling in like slow waves. It clung to the wood, to my coat, to the lantern's weak flame. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to step back into the mud, to retreat from this perfect, doorless trap. But curiosity anchored me. I watched as the shadows shifted again, pacing the unseen floor, moving closer to the windows, closer to the glass that separated us. I could feel them breathing, hear it faintly, like a whisper through wet walls. I touched the cabin, the wood cold and slick under my fingers. No handle, no crack, no seam to force an opening. Just wood and shadows, and the weight of eyes I could not see. A branch snapped in the distance. The cabin froze. The shadows halted as if listening to the same noise. I held my breath, and in that moment, the swamp itself seemed to inhale with me. I stepped back. My boots sank, mud-wet and clingy. The cabin remained, unmoved, impossibly perfect, windows dark and silent. No doors. I walked away slowly, lantern held high, never looking back for more than a heartbeat. But even as the fog swallowed it behind me, I could feel it. The cabin's gaze, stretching without eyes, watching as I disappeared into the reeds, and I knew I would see it again. Somewhere in the mist, doorless, waiting. Night settled over the swamp like a soft, wet blanket, pressing against my shoulders, crawling into my sleeves. Mist drifted over the water, pale and thick, curling around the reeds, folding over itself until the world beyond seemed to vanish. The lantern's glow barely pierced the darkness, pale and trembling in the damp air. I knelt at the water's edge, reaching for a sip from the still pool, when I noticed bubbles rising slowly, deliberately, small at first, glimmering faintly under the lantern's pale light. And then, whispers, soft, almost inaudible. A rustle beneath the water's surface, low and sighing, curling around my ankles. I froze. Each whisper seemed to stretch, lingering longer than it should, as if the water itself remembered every sound I had ever made. I leaned closer, drawn by the curiosity I could not resist. The whispers grew clearer, forming fragments of words. I thought I heard my name, a warning perhaps, or an invitation. The bubbles rose faster, breaking the surface with tiny pops that sounded too precise, too deliberate. The whispers followed each one, rising with them. It was as if the swamp itself were speaking, calling, coaxing me closer. I shivered, and the lantern's light flickered, dancing across the water, across the reeds. Every reflection seemed wrong. Shapes moved beneath the surface, shifting slowly, just out of reach, just beyond recognition. I held my breath, and the whispers came nearer. I wanted to step back, but my boots were rooted in the mud. The swamp held me, each bubble, each soft sigh, pressing closer to the surface, closer to me. I could feel the cold, damp air wrapping around my neck, settling in my hair, creeping under my coat. The whispers were patient, persistent. I tried to speak softly to calm myself, but the sound of my own voice was drowned immediately by the rising chorus beneath the water. It echoed against the reeds, twisted and distorted, faintly mocking my attempt at courage. I stared into the water, watching as the bubbles formed patterns. They circled each other, spiraled outward, rising slowly toward the surface. And in them I thought I saw shapes. Pale arms, perhaps, reaching, or maybe reflections twisted by the ripples. Every time I blinked, the shapes shifted, closer. A cold brush of air slid across my face. The whispers grew louder, though still soft, just on the edge of hearing. Closer now, pressing against my eardrums in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I realized the swamp had drawn the voices toward me, not randomly, not by accident. It was aware. The lantern trembled in my hand. Its light, though steady, seemed to strain against the darkness gathering in the mist. I thought I could see shadows moving beneath the surface, crouching, bending toward the edge of the water. And for a moment, the whispers became almost words, almost language, almost understanding. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to run. But every step backward sank my boots deeper into the mud, until it felt as if the swamp had grown arms of its own. Grasping, holding, the bubbles rose higher, breaking through the surface with a wet pop, scattering ripples across the water. The whispers followed them, curling around my ankles, brushing my knees, slipping under my coat. I could feel them in my hair, in the nape of my neck, sliding down my spine. The swamp was alive, breathing, speaking beneath the water, coaxing me to listen, to lean closer, to join it. I clenched the lantern, forcing myself to step back. The whispers hesitated, but they did not stop. They followed, patient, circling the edge of the water like ghosts on soft feet. I stumbled backward, the mud sucking at me, pulling at my boots, my legs, my resolve. The lantern's light flickered again, throwing pale shadows across the reeds. And then, just as quickly, the whispers withdrew slightly, leaving only the soft hiss of water against mud. I sat heavily on the ground, breathing in short, shallow bursts. The swamp seemed to exhale with me. The bubbles ceased for a moment, the water's surface calm, reflecting the pale light like a mirror. But I knew they would rise again. The whispers would return. And I knew something else. The more I listened, the closer they would come. The swamp, patient and watchful, had no need to hurry. It would wait for me. It would follow me, in quiet, subtle ways, until I no longer noticed it. Until I belonged beneath the water. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the calm surface, the lantern's flame steady, fragile, defiant. The whispers had pulled back, but they lingered, soft and patient, beneath the water, beneath the mud, beneath everything I thought I knew. I rose at last, my boots heavy with wet mud, lantern held high. The swamp seemed to lean away as I moved, but I could feel it, always beneath the surface, waiting, watching, whispers curling up, brushing my ankles, teasing me to return, and I knew if I ever came back, I would hear them again. beneath the water, beneath the surface, always whispering. Fog draped the swamp like a curtain, thick and wet, clinging to my coat, seeping into my hair. The reeds whispered in the soft wind, brushing my arms with cold fingers. Night had settled. Again, darker than before, as if the swamp had swallowed every trace of light. That's when I saw it. A pale shape, leaning at the very edge of the trees. Not moving, not blinking, just there. Its color was wrong, paler than moonlight, almost luminous against the shadows of the fog. I blinked. It was closer than it had been before. I stopped, boots sinking slightly into the mud. The shape didn't shift, didn't breathe, but I could feel its presence. The air around it hummed faintly, like static brushing against my skin. I raised my lantern slowly. The flame trembled as I brought it closer to the figure. It did not react. But every time the fog shifted, it seemed to lean slightly forward, inching toward me, closer. Just beyond the circle of light, I took a cautious step forward. The reeds parted around me, wet and slick. Every footfall echoed softly, swallowed immediately by the thick fog. The shape remained, watching, waiting. I tried to see it fully, tried to discern arms, legs, a face, but the fog warped everything, stretched shadows in impossible ways. It was always just beyond comprehension, just beyond understanding, and that made it worse, more real. A twig snapped behind me. I whipped around, lantern shaking in my grip. Nothing moved, only the reeds swaying as if something had passed through, unseen. When I turned back, the shape was closer. I swear it had moved, though the fog could have been lying. My heart thudded in my chest, a slow, heavy drum. The lantern's pale light flickered, struggling against the mist. The shape leaned further, still silent, still still. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn and flee, but my legs refused. I forced myself to step closer, and the swamp seemed to close around me. The reeds pressed tighter, the mud sucked harder at my boots, the air thicker, heavier. It was waiting, patient, eternal. I tried to breathe slowly, to calm the shiver crawling down my spine. The lantern's flame steadied slightly. I could see its pale shape more clearly now, tall, impossibly thin, unnaturally still. It did not move like a person, not like an animal. It simply existed, leaning, always leaning. I whispered to myself, soft enough that only I could hear. It's just fog, just shadows. But even as I said it, my voice felt swallowed by the swamp. The figure remained, silent, patient, impossibly close. Time stretched. The fog shifted slowly, and I realized it had moved again, closer, leaning just inside the tree line, its outline brushing against the darkness. The swamp pressed against, my chest wet and cold like it was breathing with me, matching my pulse. I wanted to turn, to retreat, but every step I took felt heavier, slower. The figure did not chase me. It did not flee. It simply leaned, always leaning, a presence that bent the fog around it. I held my lantern higher. Its pale glow trembled, catching the edges of the figure. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw eyes. Or maybe it was my own reflection in the mist, twisted by fear. Either way, the feeling lingered. I was being measured, observed. The reeds whispered again, wet and soft, brushing my hands, my legs, my coat. I shivered, and the figure remained, leaning, waiting. Eventually, I stepped backward slowly. Mud sucking at my boots, fog pressing against my face. I did not look away, not fully. By the time I found firmer ground beyond the reeds, the shape had faded slightly, merging with the mist. But I could still feel it there, just at the edge of my vision, closer than I had ever let anything be before, watching, patient, and I knew it would not leave. Not completely, not until I left the swamp entirely, or it decided otherwise. I walked on, lantern steady, pulse slowing, but every step carried the weight of the pale shape leaning somewhere just beyond the trees. The fog whispered around me, and the swamp held its breath. The swamp was quieter than usual that night. Mist curled low over the water, pale and clinging, hiding the reeds and hiding everything beyond them. My boots sank softly in the mud as I walked along the bank, lantern raised, its pale glow trembling across the rippling water. That's when I saw it. A boat. Small, wooden, abandoned. No oars, no paddles, and yet it drifted steadily toward the shore, cutting through the current as if guided by some quiet hand beneath the water. I stopped. The lantern trembled in my grip, the flame shaking against the fog. The boat moved with a silent grace, slicing the dark water without splash or sound. It didn't drift randomly. It followed the curve of the bank, edging closer, gliding as if it knew I would notice. I crouched at the edge, mud cold and wet beneath my hands. The water lapped gently against the boat's hull, pale reflections trembling across its worn wood. It was empty, or at least I thought it was. I leaned closer, peering into the hollow interior. Nothing. Only the smell of damp wood, decay, and something faintly metallic, faintly wrong. I considered stepping in. Curiosity pulled at me, soft but insistent. But every instinct screamed at me to wait, to watch, to stay on the bank. The boat floated steadily, inching closer, patient, persistent. I held the lantern higher. Its pale light stretched over the water, glinting off the mist. For a moment I thought I saw movement inside the boat, a shadow that shifted, but not like a person, not like an animal, just presence. Patient, quiet, waiting. The swamp itself seemed to lean toward the water, fog rolling over the surface like slow waves. Every sound of the reeds, every distant croak of frogs was muted, swallowed by the night. The boat continued to drift, as if pulled by some invisible tide, unwavering, steady, inevitable. I knelt closer, fingers brushing the water's edge. Cold seeped into my skin. The boat glided nearer until I could see the scratches on its sides, worn wood softened by years of damp. I could smell the water rising through the cracks, the swamp claiming it slowly, quietly. A ripple moved beneath the surface, faint at first, like a small fish, then another. And I realized the water wasn't empty. Something followed, something unseen, its movements measured, circling the boat, moving it forward. I could feel its presence in the sway of the reeds, in the cold brush against my boots. The boat drew nearer, closer than I had ever imagined something could approach silently. I thought of stepping in, of letting it carry me, but my hands shook, the lantern trembling, the pale flame flickering. The water pressed against me, cold and patient, and I knew the boat was not waiting for me to decide. It was moving on its own. I whispered to myself, soft, hesitant, barely audible. Not real, just water, just wood. The words felt meaningless against the stillness, against the patient glide of the boat. It moved forward, cutting through the fog, pale and inevitable. I watched it pass by, drifting past the reeds, past the edge of the swamp I thought I knew. Every ripple in the water, every soft splash against its hull was precise, deliberate, as if the swamp itself guided it. And I realized I was holding my breath, tense, waiting for some cue, some warning. But none came. The boat disappeared briefly behind a bend in the reeds, only to reappear, still moving, still steady, as if it had always been following me. I stepped closer to the water, tempted, drawn by some quiet fascination I could not name. And I felt it then, beneath my boots, beneath the mud, the water. The swamp pulsing, patient, alive. And the boat, part of it. Waiting. Watching. I did not step in. I did not call out. I only stood, lantern held high as the boat glided silently past me, moving through the fog as if it had a purpose I could not comprehend. It disappeared into the mist eventually, swallowed by the pale fog, leaving only faint ripples in its wake. I remained at the water's edge long after, staring into the mist, listening to the faint lap of water against unseen hulls. Every shadow seemed to hint at its return. Every ripple whispered the memory of its glide. The swamp had shown me something patient, something that moved without effort, without sound, guided by some unseen will, and I knew, if I returned, the boat would be waiting. Not for me, for anyone. Silent, steady, patient, moving through the mist, carrying something unseen across water that was alive. I stepped back finally, boots heavy with mud, lantern trembling in my hand. The swamp exhaled slowly, wet and quiet, and I kept walking, knowing it had been there, and that it would be there again. The swamp grew darker as I approached the bridge. Rotted wood stretched across the water, slick with moss, each plank bending slightly under my weight. The air was thick with mist, carrying the smell of mud, decaying leaves, and something faintly metallic. Every step made a soft creak, swallowed immediately by the swamp's quiet. I paused at the center, lantern held high. The water flowed silently beneath, black and still, reflecting nothing but the pale glow of the lantern. And then I saw them. Eyes, glowing faintly beneath the bridge, round, unblinking, watching. Every time I shifted the lantern's light, they blinked out, only to return when the glow passed. I froze. The reeds whispered softly around me, brushing against my arms. The water lapped gently, almost coaxing, as if it wanted me to lean closer. I swallowed. The eyes stayed, patient, circling beneath the bridge, moving with the current but remaining eerily fixed on me. I knelt at the edge of the planks, trying to see more clearly. Reflections danced across the water, the pale lantern glow fracturing and stretching shapes into something unfamiliar. The eyes seemed larger in the lantern's light. Not human, not animal, but something aware. A shiver ran down my spine. The wood groaned softly beneath my boots. I wanted to step back, to retreat, but I could not tear my gaze from the water. I tried to imagine them gone. Tried to tell myself it was the swamp, the fog, my own fear. But the eyes remained, silent, patient, watching. And I felt, more than saw, a weight pressing from below. The lantern flickered. A cold breeze slid along the water, brushing my neck, slipping under my coat. The eyes blinked once, then again, perfectly in sync with the trembling flame. I realized then that they were not just observing. They were waiting, calculating. I leaned slightly forward, toes pressing against the edge of the plank. The water's surface shimmered, smooth and black, disturbed only by the faintest ripple. I could hear wet, soft movements beneath, like something brushing against the submerged wood. My reflection stared back at me, lantern trembling in my grip. And for a moment it blinked slightly after I did. I jumped back instinctively. The eyes did not vanish. They remained, pinned beneath the bridge, glowing faintly, patient, unyielding. Every instinct screamed to run, to leave the bridge, the swamp, the watching water behind. But I could not move fast enough. A branch cracked somewhere in the reeds. I spun, lantern shaking, heart hammering. Nothing. Only the fog rolling silently across the water, hiding shapes I did not dare name. When I turned back, the eyes were still there, blinking slowly, waiting. I knelt again, lantern raised. The current moved softly, carrying ripples across the water, and I thought I saw shapes moving beneath the surface, thin, long, stretching with the flow. The eyes followed them, tracing movements I could not comprehend. The swamp felt alive, patient, pressing in around the bridge, around my chest, around my ears. I whispered, barely audible into the mist. Not real. Not real, not real. The words dissolved immediately, swallowed by the cold, damp air. The eyes did not respond, but they remained, fixed beneath the bridge, unblinking, eternal. Finally, I stepped back, boots pressing into the soft mud at the bank. The bridge groaned softly, the lantern's light trembling across the fog. The eyes blinked once more, then faded slightly beneath the dark water, leaving only faint ripples in their wake. I did not turn my back. I kept them in sight until the bank widened enough to feel solid beneath my feet. Even then, I knew they would remain, waiting, beneath the bridge, beneath the water, watching anyone who dared cross. I walked on slowly, lantern held high, listening to the swamp exhale around me. The eyes had not left. They were patient, silent, and I knew they would be there long after I disappeared into the fog. The fog pressed close that night, thick and heavy, curling over the water and weaving through the reeds. My lantern's pale light trembled against the gray haze, flickering as though uncertain of its own strength. The swamp was quiet, but I thought I heard something. Soft bells. Far away at first, faint, like tiny chimes caught in the wind. No hands, no figure carrying them, only their delicate ringing, echoing across the fog. The sound drifted through the reeds, twisting and stretching, carrying just enough to draw me forward. I walked slowly, boots sinking into wet mud, water dripping from reeds onto my coat. Every step made a soft squelch, swallowed immediately by the thick mist. The bells rang again, slightly closer this time, clearer but still impossibly distant. They were gentle, melodic, comforting almost, but wrong in the way that the swamp itself felt wrong. The fog shifted as I moved. Shapes appeared and vanished in the corners of my vision. Reeds swayed without wind, and the bells rang again, faintly metallic now, vibrating through the air and settling in my bones. I realized my lantern's flame trembled with each chime, fragile against the fog's pull. I followed. The sound carried me deeper into the swamp, through channels of water that I didn't remember seeing before. The reeds closed in, brushing wet against my arms, my neck, my cheeks. The bells grew clearer, more deliberate, as if guiding me somewhere. And with each step I felt the fog move with me, alive, breathing, reshaping the path beneath my boots. I paused. The bells lingered in the air, soft, patient. I could not see anyone. There was no source, and yet I knew it would not stop. The fog seemed to carry the sound, echoing it endlessly, folding it back into itself. The reeds parted. For a moment I thought I glimpsed shapes, tall, thin, leaning just beyond the lantern's glow. But they were gone the next instant, leaving only the fog and the bells, guiding me deeper, further, twisting the swamp into corridors I could not recognize. I called out softly, "Who is there?" My voice felt swallowed immediately by the mist, distorted, stretched, returned to me in a hollow echo that was not my own. The bells answered with a faint, clear chime. Closer, mocking, patient. I stepped forward again. The fog seemed to thicken around me, pressing against my chest, curling in my hair, dripping down my sleeves. Every step felt heavier. The bells continued, now almost metallic, vibrating faintly in the lantern glass. I could feel them in my teeth, in my bones, in the marrow of my fingers. I tried to follow them carefully. Each chime led me past water pools that mirrored my lantern, past reeds that whispered as I passed. I thought I could sense shapes moving, but every time I looked, they were gone. The fog was alive, stretching, bending the world into something unfamiliar. I realized then that the path I followed was endless. Every bell brought me deeper, but never to the source. The fog moved with me, alive, aware, shaping the swamp to trap me. And the bells rang on, patient, inevitable, guiding me into isolation, confusion, and silence. I stopped, lantern trembling in my hands. The bells faded slightly, still present, now more distant but impossible to ignore. I could feel them lingering, carried on the fog, winding through the reeds, echoing endlessly in the swamp's lungs. I tried to retrace my steps, but the swamp had changed. The channels of water were unfamiliar, the reeds taller, closing in, brushing wet against my skin. Every echo of the bells seemed to bend the path, folding the fog around me like hands. I was alone with the fog and the endless ringing, drawn forward by a sound that had no source. I held my lantern higher, trembling, casting pale light across the water and reeds. And I understood. The swamp was alive. The fog carried it. The bells guided it. And I was already a part of it, trapped in a world that reshaped itself with every step. The bells rang once more, faint, metallic, patient. I took a slow breath, boots sinking in the wet mud. And I walked on, following, endlessly, deeper into the fog. Night fell like a heavy cloth, wet and cold, pressing down on the swamp. Mist curled low over the water, curling around my boots and dripping from the reeds onto my coat. The lantern's pale glow flickered against the fog, hesitant, fragile, as if it too feared the darkness. I sat by my small camp, mud damp beneath me, trying to calm the unease that had been growing since sundown. The swamp was quiet, or so I thought. Then it came, a knock. Hollow, slow, deliberate. Not from wood, not from stone, but through the air, through the earth itself. It echoed softly across the swamp, bouncing between reeds and water, curling around me like a living thing. I froze. The lantern trembled in my hands. The knock came again. Hollow, echoing, regular. Like someone or something was counting, patiently, deliberately, waiting. I whispered to myself, soft and low, trying to convince my own ears. Just the swamp. Just the wind. But the sound persisted, growing closer, folding around the edges of the tent, pressing into the mud beneath my boots. I rose slowly, boots sinking into soft mud. The lantern's pale flame quivered. Another knock, closer now, sharper, as if it had moved. I stepped out of the tent. The swamp was empty, only reeds swaying, mist curling over water, shadows that shifted with the lantern's glow. I held the lantern high, scanning, trying to see where the sound came from. It came again, from all directions at once, behind the reeds, beneath the water, deep in the mud, hollow, patient, waiting. I stepped toward the sound. Each footfall squelched in the wet earth. The knocks followed, pacing me, circling me, keeping rhythm with my pulse. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but I could feel the swamp bending around it, guiding it, shaping it to trap me. The tent shivered suddenly. The knocking came from inside now. From beneath the canvas, the fabric trembling against the poles. My heart hammered. I held the lantern closer. The hollow echoes pressed against my ears, vibrating through the soles of my boots. I dared not breathe. I peered inside. Nothing. Just the empty tent, my pack, my firelight barely touching the corners of the canvas. The knock came again. Inside, soft, hollow, deliberate. I tried to leave, to step away, but the swamp had changed. Every path I had taken twisted in the fog, reeds pressing wet against my coat, pulling me back toward the sound. The knocks grew louder, circling closer, coming from the earth, the reeds, the air, the very water itself. I whispered into the mist, soft and trembling. Not real, not real. But the hollow knocking did not stop. It answered me, patient, deliberate, echoing in rhythm with my own pulse. I held the lantern higher, trying to pierce the fog, to see, to understand. The knocking followed every movement, circling faster, folding over the swamp like living fingers. I realized then that the swamp was alive in ways I could not comprehend. The sound came not from wood or stone, but from the swamp itself, from the mud, from the reeds, from the very air I breathed. I stepped backward, boots sinking deeper into wet mud. The knocks pressed closer, sharper now, echoing inside my chest as much as around me. My fire sputtered, weak against the fog, struggling to stay alight. I shivered, holding the lantern like a shield. The knocks came again, inside the tent. Hollow, deliberate, patient. I could feel them, something in the swamp, patient and immense, pressing against the edges of my awareness. It did not need to move. It did not need to speak. It only waited. And the knocking echoed, a reminder that I was never truly alone here. Hours passed. The hollow knocks continued, soft and deliberate, circling, pressing. I sat by the dying fire, lantern trembling in my hands, trying not to move. The swamp inhaled and exhaled with me, mist curling closer, reeds brushing against my arms and legs. And the knocking came again, patient, inside, outside, everywhere at once. I closed my eyes, tried to imagine silence, but the hollow knock persisted, and I understood with a cold certainty that it would not stop. Not until I left, or until the swamp chose otherwise. When I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, the knock softened, patient, echoing beneath the canvas. And I knew, deep in the damp mud, deep in the fog, deep in the reeds, that the swamp had marked its rhythm, and I would carry it with me forever. Night pressed over the swamp like damp velvet, heavy and cold. Mist curled over the water, thick and unyielding, swallowing the edges of the reeds and the faint glow of my lantern. The air smelled of mud, decay, and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood long forgotten. I knelt at the water's edge, reaching for a sip from the dark, still pool. The lantern's flame trembled in my hands, flickering across the surface, dancing in the mist. And then I saw it. A pale arm, floating just beneath the water. Not completely submerged, not completely hidden. Fingers thin, delicate, unnaturally still. The skin glowed faintly in the lantern's light, almost translucent. I froze. The water rippled slightly, brushing against the arm as if it were waiting, patient, aware. I leaned closer. Curiosity tugged at me, soft but insistent, whispering that I should touch it, see if it was real. My hand hovered over the water, trembling. I could feel the chill seep through my sleeves, up my arm, into my bones, and yet I couldn't pull away. The air around me was silent. Even the reeds held their breath. I whispered to myself, it's just an arm. Just the water. Just reflection. But the water did not hold a reflection. It held something alive, patient, waiting beneath the surface. I reached in slowly. The water was icy, wet fingers pressing against my own as I brushed the arm. And then, just as softly as I touched it, the arm retracted, like a shadow sliding back into the depths. My heart slammed in my chest. I gasped. The lantern wavered, casting pale, trembling light across the water. I knelt, frozen, staring. The water remained still, dark, almost black, hiding whatever had withdrawn. But I could feel it beneath, patient, deliberate, something aware of my presence. The mist rolled across the surface, curling toward me, brushing my neck, settling in my hair. I tried to imagine it gone, tried to tell myself it was just my mind, just tiredness, just fear. But when I leaned closer again, the arm appeared, floating, pale, still, waiting, patient, as if inviting me to reach once more. The lantern trembled in my hands, and I realized how alone I was. The swamp pressed in around me, reeds brushing against my arms, water curling at my boots, mist clinging wet to my hair and coat. No sound but the gentle lap of water against the bank, and the arm, glowing faintly, unnaturally, reaching toward the lantern's pale flame. I whispered again, soft and trembling, "Not real. Not real, not real." The words felt hollow, meaningless, because it was real enough to freeze me in place, real enough to pull at the edges of my sanity, to test patience, curiosity, and fear all at once. I reached out again, fingers trembling. The water rippled beneath my hand. The arm moved slightly, brushing against my fingertips. Cold, wet, impossibly soft. And then it pulled away again, deeper, into darkness I could not see. I sat back slowly, lantern held high, chest tight with cold and fear. The arm did not reappear. The water remained still, calm, patient. But I knew it waited. Beneath the surface, beneath the mud, beneath everything I could not comprehend. The swamp inhaled around me, mist curling closer, brushing against my ears, my neck, my hands. I could feel it pressing in, patient, aware, guiding me, watching. The lantern flickered one last time, pale flame trembling, casting shadows across the reeds and water. I rose finally, boots heavy with mud, heart still hammering. The arm did not follow, but I could feel it in the water, in the darkness, lingering just beyond my sight, patient, waiting. I walked slowly back to my camp. Lantern held high, every step careful, every breath shallow. The swamp exhaled behind me, gentle, wet, whispering in ways I could not name. And I knew if I returned to the water, if I stayed too long, the pale arm would appear again. Waiting, patient, unyielding. I kept moving, lantern shaking in my grip, the swamp silent, but alive. And beneath the water, I could feel it watching still, Night draped the swamp in a thick, wet blanket, mist curling low over the water, soft and heavy. My lantern trembled in my hands, pale flame barely touching the reeds, barely keeping the darkness at bay. The air smelled of damp mud, rotting leaves, and the faint metallic tang of something unseen beneath the water. Then I heard it. A bird, or something like a bird. Its song rose from the reeds, soft, high, almost human. A strange, eerie melody that lingered longer than a normal bird could. It was beautiful and wrong. I stopped, boots pressing into the wet mud. The song pulsed through the swamp, curling around my ears, brushing the back of my neck, vibrating in my chest. I whispered to myself, "It's just a bird. Just the swamp." But the voice, soft and melodic, carried an intelligence, awareness. The song drew me forward. Through the reeds, over shallow pools of water, along twisted paths of mud I did not recognize. The closer I moved, the closer the song came, not always from the same place. Sometimes behind me, sometimes ahead, sometimes above. Every note stretched impossibly long, echoing, bending with the fog. I raised my lantern, trying to see. Nothing perched on the reeds. Nothing moved in the trees. And yet the song continued, hovering, patient, deliberate. The swamp pressed in around me, mist curling along my sleeves, water seeping into my boots, reeds brushing soft against my coat. Every note felt like it was testing me, measuring my fear, teasing my curiosity. I wanted to run. I wanted to step back. But I couldn't. The melody shifted then. Closer, richer, impossibly human. I stopped entirely, heart thundering in my chest. The bird, if it was a bird, sang from places where no bird could perch, across channels of water, through thick reeds, even beneath the mud itself. It was everywhere, and nowhere. I whispered into the fog, "Not real, not real." The song twisted softly, echoing the words back at me, bending them, stretching them, carrying them across the swamp in a voice that was not my own. I moved cautiously, lantern raised. The song followed, weaving through the reeds, rippling across the water's surface. Every step I took made a soft squelch in the mud, but the song did not falter. It lingered, patient, deliberate, drawing me toward places I did not recognize, places that felt both familiar and impossible. A shadow flickered through the mist. I blinked. The song shifted again, closer, bending around me, teasing me to look, to see. But when I turned, nothing was there. Only fog, reeds, and the faint glow of my lantern trembling in the dark. The swamp seemed to breathe with the song, exhaling and inhaling through the reeds, through the water, through the mist itself. Every note pressed against my skin, vibrating in my bones, whispering something I could not understand. And I realized I was not following the bird. The bird was following me. Or perhaps the swamp was singing through it. I stopped again. The song floated across the water, impossibly near, impossibly far. It hovered just beyond the lantern's light, patient, watchful, and aware. I could feel it pressing against the back of my neck, sliding through my hair, wrapping around my chest. Every instinct screamed a move to escape, but the song did not allow it. I whispered once more, trembling, "Not real, not real." And yet the melody continued, rising, falling, bending in ways that no natural bird could. It drew me forward, always forward, through channels of water, through reeds taller than my head, over mud that sucked at my boots. Eventually, I stopped, hands shaking, lantern trembling, heart hammering. The song lingered in the air, soft now, patient, almost gentle, but I knew it would not leave. It would follow. Waiting in the reeds, in the mist, across every path I thought I knew. I moved on slowly, boots heavy with wet mud, lantern held high. The swamp exhaled around me, soft, patient, and the song drifted behind me, echoing across water and reeds, reminding me of something I could not name, something that was both wonder and unease, and I understood then. It would sing again tomorrow. And the next night, closer, always closer. Fog rolled low across the swamp that night, curling over the water, threading through the reeds, damp and heavy. The lantern trembled in my hands, pale light wavering against shadows that seemed too long, too still. The swamp was quiet, too quiet, but then I saw it. A shack, small, wooden, leaning just enough to make the fog bend around it. It had appeared overnight, though I could not remember seeing it before. Its walls were dark, wet with fog, and the windows caught my lantern's glow like dark, patient eyes. I stopped, boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The shack remained perfectly still, and yet it felt aware, patient, watching. I stepped closer. The reeds brushed against my coat, wet and cold. The boards creaked faintly under their own weight, though no wind stirred. I lifted the lantern higher. The windows reflected my pale light. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw a shadow inside, moving just beyond the glass. I swallowed. The swamp pressed in around me, fog curling, thick and wet, damp in my hair, seeping through my sleeves. I wanted to leave, but something, curiosity perhaps, kept me rooted. I stepped closer. The shack seemed smaller than it should have been, yet perfectly intact. No doors, no obvious way inside. Only the faint creak of the boards, like quiet breathing. I stared at it for a long moment. And when I blinked, it had shifted. Not far, not obviously, but closer. Leaning slightly toward me as if curious about my presence, I gasped softly. The swamp seemed to shift with it. The reeds whispered against my arms, the mud pressing at my boots, water curling softly around the edges of my lantern's pale light. The shack remained, patient, deliberate, always leaning, always observing. I stepped back, heart hammering. But the shack shifted again. Closer. Not like it had moved by chance. It had been moving the entire time, silently, slowly, through the fog. Closer to my camp, closer to me. The mist thickened. The lantern trembled in my hands. I could barely see the edges of the shack. Yet I felt its presence pressing against the fog, against the swamp, against me. I whispered softly, barely audible, "Stay still." But it did not listen. I turned, trying to leave, but the swamp itself seemed altered. Paths I had walked before were gone, swallowed by fog and reeds. The shack had moved again, leaning just enough to block the way back, always just at the edge of vision. Patient, waiting. I stopped. The lantern flickered. The windows reflected pale light, shadows shifting inside like something alive, something aware. I could feel it in the sway of the reeds, the pull of the mud, the damp air curling around my coat and hair. I whispered again, soft and shaking, "Not real. Not real." The shack leaned closer, silently, impossibly close, and I realized it had been doing this all along, tracking me through the fog, through the reeds, through the swamp itself. It moved not because it wanted to, but because it could. Because the swamp allowed it. Because it was patient. I backed away slowly, lantern held high, heart hammering in my chest. The shack remained, silent, leaning toward me, patient. And I knew it would follow, not by chance, not by whim, but inevitably, every night, every fog, every step I took through this swamp. By morning, it was gone. Or at least I thought it was. The fog lifted slightly, revealing reeds and mud I recognized, familiar paths and channels of water. But I could feel it in the air, in the mist curling low across the swamp, in the subtle bend of the reeds. The shack had not truly left. It would return, always closer, always leaning, patient. I moved on slowly, boots heavy with mud, lantern shaking in my hand. The swamp exhaled softly around me, curling fog along my sleeves, brushing against my neck, and I knew it was waiting. For the next night, for the next fog. For me, the swamp was quiet that night, thick fog curling low over water and reeds, pressing against my boots and coat. The lantern in my hands cast a pale glow, fragile and trembling against the darkness. Every step made a soft squelch in the mud, every breath caught slightly in the damp air. Then I saw it, a lantern, hanging from a low branch, its pale flame burning steadily despite the wet fog. No cord, no chain, no sign of who could have placed it. It glowed softly, pale and calm, inviting. And beyond it, another. and another. A path of lanterns stretching deeper into the swamp, each one flickering gently, guiding me forward. I stepped carefully, boots pressing into wet mud. The lanterns formed a path that seemed deliberate, almost safe. For the first time in days, I felt a strange calm, a quiet hope. Perhaps following them would lead me out. Perhaps someone else had walked here before me. The fog shifted. Reeds whispered against my sleeves, water curling at my boots, air thick and damp. I followed the lanterns step by step, watching their pale flames sway softly in the mist. The path led me past channels of water, over mud soft enough to sink boots, past reeds taller than my head. The lanterns were patient. Each one seemed to wait for me to reach it, burning steadily as I approached. The swamp exhaled around me, mist curling along the path, pressing against my hair, settling damp against my neck. I whispered softly to myself, almost there, and for a moment, hope felt real. The path curved. One lantern swayed in the mist, faint and flickering. Its flame wavered in the damp air, trembling like a heartbeat. I stepped closer, and then it sputtered, a pale light shivering in the fog. And with it, my courage faltered. I reached out, hands trembling, to steady the lantern. The flame shivered again, small and weak, then steadied for a brief moment before dimming once more. I realized I was alone, completely alone. The swamp pressed in around me, reeds brushing against my arms, water curling at my boots, mist clinging to my coat and hair. The lanterns did not guide me anymore. They waited. And the last one, the final flame at the end of the path, sputtered out entirely, leaving me in silence. The fog swallowed everything. The other lanterns vanished, one by one, as if they had never been there. I was left in darkness, surrounded by reeds, water, and the damp, patient air of the swamp. No light, no path, no hope. I held my lantern higher, but the flame trembled weakly in the fog, pale and insufficient. The swamp exhaled around me, curling mist over my face, dripping cold into my hair. I could hear the faint rustle of reeds, the soft lap of water, and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, nothing else. Silence. Patient, endless silence, I whispered into the darkness, soft and trembling. Not real. Not real. But the swamp did not answer. It only waited. The fog wrapped tighter, pressing around my chest, curling wet around my wrists and ankles. I realized the path had never been safe. It had only existed to draw me forward. I stepped slowly, boots heavy, lantern shaking in my hands. Every step made the swamp shift, water rippling softly, reeds brushing wet against my coat. The last lantern's flame had left me exposed, alone, in a swamp that had always been alive, patient, aware. I understood then that following the path had only led me deeper. Further into isolation, further into the fog, I whispered again, barely audible. It's just fog. Just reeds, just me. But the swamp did not care. It waited. The fog curling around my head, pressing damp against my hair, wrapping the silence tightly around my chest. I walked on, lantern trembling, boots heavy in the mud, every step measured, every breath shallow. The swamp exhaled around me, wet and patient. And I knew, even if I moved forward for hours, for days, the path of lanterns would never return. Hope had flickered, sputtered, and died, leaving only fog and silence. The swamp was still, but not silent. Mist hung thick over the water, curling between reeds, settling heavy on my coat and hair. My lantern flickered weakly, pale light trembling against the fog, and then I heard it, a soft hum. At first, gentle, like cicadas hidden in the reeds. A vibration in the air, low and distant, brushing against my ears and chest. The swamp seemed to pulse with it, faint and patient, almost comforting. I stopped, boots pressing into the wet mud, heart thumping softly. The hum shifted. Closer now, vibrating through the bones, shaking the glass of the lantern. A metallic undertone threaded through it, subtle, dissonant, unnatural. I whispered soft, almost to myself, it's just wind. Just reeds. But it was not. The humming grew, gentle but insistent, wrapping around the reeds, around the water, around me. Every step I took seemed to echo in its rhythm. The swamp exhaled with it, fog curling around my sleeves, pressing against my neck. I could feel the vibration in my teeth, in my chest, in the marrow of my fingers. I raised the lantern higher, trying to pierce the fog, trying to see. Shapes moved in the mist, just at the edge of vision. Leaning, shifting, impossible to track. And the hum followed, bending around them, lingering, pressing closer, patient. I tried to step back. But the swamp shifted beneath my boots, mud soft, water curling at the edges, reeds brushing wet against my coat. The hum grew sharper, vibrating now in ways that made the air feel alive, metallic, resonant. I whispered again, "Not real." Not real. The sound echoed in response, stretching impossibly long, wrapping through the fog, through the reeds, vibrating in the lantern glass. I turned slowly, boots squelching in wet mud, lantern shaking. Everywhere I looked, the fog pulsed with the sound, bending the world, shaping it around me, and I realized I could not locate it. No source, only resonance. Only the swamp itself humming, alive and patient, moving beneath the fog. A shadow flickered in the mist. I blinked. The humming rose slightly, sharper, metallic, almost cruel in its persistence. It pressed against my ribs, the bones in my chest vibrating softly, painfully, echoing in ways I could not name. I wanted to call out, to speak, to break the sound, but my lips refused to move. I stepped carefully forward, lantern raised high, trying to keep the pale light ahead of me. The swamp shifted with each step, reeds brushing wet against my arms, water lapping softly at the mud. The hum followed, patient, deliberate, bending around me, alive. It seemed to test me, measure me, shape the fog into corridors I could not escape. I whispered again, low, soft, trembling. Just fog. Just swamp. Just me. The humming wrapped tighter, resonating, vibrating in the lantern, in the fog, in the very air I breathed. I could feel it in my teeth, in my ears, in my chest. It was everywhere. And nowhere. The mist swirled, curling low across water and mud, pressing against my face, my neck, my hair. Every movement made the hum shift, bending through reeds, over channels of water, around shadows I could not name. It was patient. I was alone. The swamp was alive. I stopped. Lantern trembling in my hands, pale flame weak against the fog. The hum pulsed gently, soft, metallic, impossible to place, echoing in the swamp's lungs. I could feel it lingering, patient, deliberate, waiting. I took a slow breath. The swamp exhaled around me, curling wet across my sleeves, pressing damp against my neck. And I knew with a quiet certainty that the hum would follow. Every night, every fog, every step I took. Bending the swamp to its rhythm, alive, patient. I moved on slowly, boots heavy in wet mud, lantern held high, every step careful, every breath shallow. The hum lingered behind me, metallic and soft, vibrating in ways I could feel but not see. And I understood with a cold clarity that I was not walking through the swamp. The swamp was moving through me. The fog hung heavy that night, thick and damp, curling low over the water and reeds. The lantern in my hands cast a pale glow, trembling against shadows that seemed to stretch beyond their edges. Every step I took pressed into soft mud, boots sinking slightly, water curling at my ankles. I felt it first as a weight, not on me but around me, a presence, patient, aware. I paused. Reeds brushed wet against my sleeves, mist curling into my hair. The swamp exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, and then it pressed closer, eyes, watching me. I lifted my lantern, pale light shaking, scanning the fog. Nothing moved, no shapes, no silhouettes, only fog and the soft ripple of water. But I knew I was not alone. The feeling pressed into my chest, a soft, cold weight, like someone breathing just beyond the mist. I whispered softly, "Not real, not real." The swamp did not answer. It only waited. I stepped forward, careful, boots sinking into mud. The fog swirled around me, curling over my shoulders, pressing damp against my neck. The weight of eyes followed. Not visible, not tangible, but present. Patient. I paused again, peering into a still pool of water. My reflection shimmered, pale lantern light dancing across ripples. And then, just for a fraction of a second, it blinked. A moment later than I did. A heartbeat delayed, and I knew, in a way I could not explain, that the watcher was patient, watching, waiting. The reeds rustled softly behind me. I spun, lantern trembling, heart hammering, nothing. Only fog curling low across channels of water, soft, patient, alive. And yet I could feel it. Closer now, pressing in, shaping the swamp, pressing patience into every shadow. I tried to speak, voice trembling softly. "Who's there?" Nothing answered. Only silence curling like the fog around my boots and sleeves. But the eyes, unseen, patient, aware, remained. I took another step, trying to keep my lantern high. Every movement made the fog shift, pressing wet against my coat and hair. The weight of watching shifted with me, following, never leaving, patient, unyielding. I could feel it in my chest, in my ears, in the marrow of my fingers. I stopped at a narrow channel of water. Reeds brushed my arms, wet and cold, curling around me. The swamp exhaled softly, mist rising in curling streams. And then I saw it again, not in the water, not in the reeds, not in the fog, but in the reflection of my lantern. A blink, delayed, impossible. I shivered, raising the lantern higher, pale light trembling. The swamp pressed in, damp and patient, reeds brushing soft against my skin, water curling at my boots. And I realized the watcher was everywhere, not visible, not tangible, but patient, aware, observing, bending the swamp to its will. I whispered softly again, "Not real. Not real." The words dissolved immediately, swallowed by the fog. And yet, the reflection blinked once more, half a heartbeat after I did. Patient, unyielding. I stepped backward slowly, boots pressing deep into the mud, lantern shaking in my hands. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the swamp bent with me, closing channels of water, curling reeds to press damp against my chest, shaping paths I thought I knew into loops I could not escape. And the eyes, unseen, followed, patient, aware, indifferent to my fear. I turned to leave, careful, shallow breaths, lantern held high. The swamp exhaled around me, mist curling low across my shoulders, pressing damp against my neck, curling around my sleeves. The watcher remained, not visible, not audible, but everywhere, patient, unblinking. Hours passed. The swamp did not shift. The mist did not fade. The weight of being observed lingered in every ripple, every breath of wind, every drop of moisture against my skin. I could feel it still, patient, deliberate, watching even when I dared not look. Finally, I reached the bank I remembered, pale lantern light touching familiar mud, reeds curling low. The swamp exhaled, folding mist and darkness around me, patient, silent, aware. The watcher did not vanish. It waited, always patient, always observing. And I knew, even if I moved on, even if I left the swamp entirely, its gaze would follow. Every reflection, every ripple, every shadow. I moved forward slowly, lantern trembling, heart heavy. The swamp breathed around me. The watcher remained, unseen, patient, and impossible to forget. The swamp seemed to stretch endlessly that night, mist curling low over dark water, threading through reeds that brushed wet against my sleeves. My boots sank into soft mud, water curling at my ankles, lantern trembling in my hands. And then I saw it, a road, half-submerged cobblestones glinting faintly in the pale lantern light. The stones were slick with water, moss curling between them, and yet the path seemed deliberate, purposeful, as if someone, or something, had placed it there for me to find. I stepped carefully onto the stones, boots pressing wet into the mossy surface. The swamp exhaled around me, curling mist low along the water's edge, brushing damp against my hair and neck. The road stretched ahead, straight at first, then curving slightly, guiding me deeper into the fog. I felt a strange calm as I walked. For a moment it seemed safe, familiar, like a memory buried beneath years of mud and reeds. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft at first, then deliberate, pressing into the wet stones behind me. I froze, boots balanced carefully on slick moss. The swamp was still, except for the sound of something walking the same cobblestones as me. I whispered softly, "Just someone else. Just someone else." But the steps mirrored mine perfectly. Every step I took, another followed. No hesitation, no pause, no error. The swamp exhaled softly around me, mist curling against my face, pressing damp along my arms. I realized then, with a creeping dread, that the footsteps could not belong to anyone else. I turned slowly. The fog swallowed everything. No one was there. No figure, no shadow. Only my boots pressed into the stones. Only the faint ripple of water along the edges, and the footsteps behind me. I quickened my pace, trying to leave the echo behind. But the footsteps matched me. Step for step. Perfectly timed, patient, deliberate. The swamp seemed to bend around the sound, reshaping paths I thought I knew, folding the fog to keep me within its rhythm. I whispered again, trembling softly, "Not real. Not real." But the sound persisted, pressing against my ears, vibrating through the lantern, through the mist, through my chest. It was everywhere, and nowhere. The road curved again, half submerged in water, cobblestones slick beneath my boots. Reeds brushed my arms, mist curling into my hair, damp pressing against my neck. Every step forward echoed behind me, every movement mirrored. The swamp held me in its rhythm, patient, aware, unyielding. I stopped at a narrow stretch of water covering the stones. The footsteps paused. A heartbeat later, they continued. Soft, deliberate, echoing in the water, pressing through the mist, hauntingly familiar. I looked down at the stones. They were slick, wet, perfectly aligned, and I understood with a cold certainty, whoever or whatever followed me had always been here, waiting, patient, endless. I stepped carefully again, boots pressing into slick moss, water curling at the edges. The swamp exhaled softly around me, mist pressing low along my sleeves, curling in my hair. I dared not glance behind, but I could feel it. Step for step, following, patient. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. I could not tell. The fog thickened, curling over water and mud, pressing damp against my coat. The swamp's breath was heavy, wet, deliberate, and the footsteps never ceased. Perfectly timed, echoing, patient. Finally, I reached the edge of the road I recognized, cobblestones disappearing beneath water and mud. The swamp exhaled softly, curling low along my boots and sleeves. The footsteps behind me persisted, fading slowly, but not entirely. I knew, even as I left the drowned road behind, that the echo would remain, step for step, patient, following. I moved on slowly, lantern trembling, boots heavy in wet mud, heart thudding against my ribs. The swamp breathed around me, curling mist low across my shoulders, pressing damp against my hair. And I knew the road, and whatever walked it, would always be there. Patient, inevitable, unyielding. The swamp was heavy that night, fog curling low over water and reeds, curling over my boots, settling damp in my hair. My lantern flickered in my hands, pale flame trembling against the mist. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Even the reeds held their breath, and then I saw it, an old church, wooden, weathered, leaning slightly to one side. Its bell tower rose above the fog, crooked, broken, rusted through in places. I could feel it before I saw it fully, something patient, waiting, pressing damp and cold against my chest. I stepped closer, boots pressing into the mud. The swamp exhaled softly around me, mist curling low along the water, brushing against my coat. The lantern trembled, pale light shaking across the reeds and water. The church seemed impossibly still, yet alive, patient, waiting. I raised the lantern higher. The bell hung crooked in the tower, rusted, decayed, silent for who knew how long. I whispered softly, just to myself, "Quiet, quiet." And for a heartbeat it was. Then it rang, a single toll, deep, resonant, hollow. The sound vibrated through the swamp, curling through fog and reeds, pressing into my chest. It was not loud, not violent, but impossible to ignore. A sound that seemed to rise from the heart of the swamp itself, patient, deliberate, aware. I froze, lantern trembling in my hands. The fog shifted around me, curling low, pressing damp along my sleeves over my hair. The bell tolled again, slow, deliberate, each chime sinking into the soft mud beneath my boots. The reeds shivered. Water rippled gently. The swamp exhaled, patient and deliberate, breathing in rhythm with the bell. I whispered softly, trembling, "Not real, not real." But the bell had already called me, and the swamp answered. The toll came again, each ring stretching longer than the last, vibrating through the fog, bending it, shaping it, curling around me. The lantern trembled. Its pale light flickered weakly across the water, across the reeds, across the swamp that now seemed alive, aware. Each chime pressed deeper into my chest, into my bones, into the marrow of my fingers. I could feel it everywhere at once, patient, endless, impossible. I stepped closer to the church, boots pressing soft into wet mud, lantern held high. The bell hung still, crooked, rusted, broken, and yet it tolled. Slowly, patiently. As if calling not just to me, but through the swamp itself, through every channel of water, every reed, every curl of fog. The mist curled around my shoulders, pressing damp against my neck. I realized I could not look away. Each toll drew me forward, shaping the swamp, guiding my steps, pressing my own pulse into its rhythm. Patient, deliberate, I whispered again, barely audible. Just fog. Just swamp. Just me. But the bell rang on, hollow, impossible, impossible to ignore. And I understood with a cold certainty that the swamp itself had answered the call. Patient, aware, alive, hours or minutes passed. I could not tell. The bell tolled again, echoing through reeds, water, mist, pressing damp against my coat and hair. The swamp exhaled softly around me, curling low along my sleeves, pressing patient, deliberate awareness against my chest. Finally, the bell fell silent. The mist hung thick, curling over water, reeds, and mud. The swamp breathed slowly, patiently, as if the toll had been a reminder. A call, and now, silence. I lowered the lantern slightly. Boots pressed into soft mud. Water curled around my ankles. And I realized, with a shiver that ran through every bone in my body, that the bell would toll again. Another night, another fog, another moment when the swamp called and the air itself carried its sound. Patient, aware, unyielding. I moved slowly, lantern trembling, boots heavy with wet mud, heart hammering softly. The fog wrapped around me, pressing damp along my sleeves, curling in my hair. And I knew the bell, the church, the swamp itself, all of it, was patient, waiting. And I would carry its toll with me forever. Dawn broke over the swamp in thin, pale streaks, fog curling low across the water, settling damp against my coat. My lantern had long since gone out, leaving only the mist and the soft, wet air. The reeds whispered softly, brushing against my arms and legs, water curling at my boots. And then I saw him, a man, sitting silently at the edge of a shallow pool, fishing rod held steady in his hands. He did not move, did not breathe noticeably, just waited. The fog curled around him soft and patient, and I realized I could not see his face. Something pressed against the edges of my mind, a sense that he was watching me, though his head remained bowed. I stepped closer, boots squelching softly in the mud. The swamp exhaled gently around me, curling mist along my sleeves, pressing damp against my neck. I whispered softly, "Hello, are you someone else?" The man did not answer. Not a twitch, not a sound. Only the rod dipping once in the water, then still. I reached a few steps closer. Reeds brushed wet against my arms, water curling softly around my boots. The fog pressed thick, damp against my face, and when I was near enough to see the man's hands, the fishing line disappeared from view. No ripples, no movement. Only the patient stillness of the swamp. I spoke again, softly, trembling. "Who are you?" Nothing. The man remained motionless, face hidden in shadow, rod held loosely, water still beneath the line. And then I blinked. He was gone. not slipped behind reeds, not hidden in fog. Gone. Only wet footprints led from the bank into the mist, curling softly into the swamp itself. Patient, deliberate, fading. I whispered, soft and cold. Where did he go? The fog answered only with silence. I knelt briefly, peering at the footprints pressed deep into soft mud. They were human enough, shoes or boots I could not tell, but the pattern led straight into the fog, curling unpredictably, twisting between reeds as if the swamp itself had swallowed him whole. The water rippled softly against the bank. The reeds whispered. The fog pressed damp against my neck, and I realized I would never see him again. I rose slowly, lanternless, boots heavy with mud, heart hammering softly. The swamp exhaled gently around me, curling low over water and reeds. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, to escape the silent presence that had vanished into nothing. But I could feel him still. Not in sight, not in sound, but lingering, patient, watching in absence. I moved cautiously, every step measured, careful, the swamp pressing in around me, reeds brushing wet along my sleeves, water curling softly over my boots, fog curling low around my shoulders. I whispered again, trembling softly. Just fog, just swamp, just me. But the absence of sound pressed against my chest, heavier than any voice could have. The swamp had swallowed him, patient, silent, and yet aware. Hours or minutes passed. I could not tell. The swamp exhaled gently around me, curling mist along the water, along the reeds, around my boots. Every ripple, every brush of reeds felt like a reminder of him, or the memory of him. Patient, gone, and yet not gone. Finally, I reached the edge of the waterway I recognized, channels curling gently through familiar reeds. The fog lingered, wrapping low around my shoulders, pressing damp against my neck. And I knew with quiet certainty that the silent fisherman had left more than footprints. He had left the feeling of being watched, of patience, of absence turned aware. And it would follow me. I moved on slowly, boots heavy with mud, heart hammering softly, chest tight. The swamp breathed around me, curling mist low across my shoulders, pressing damp along my sleeves. And I understood with a shiver that the fisherman, and whatever he had been, was patient, silent, and always just beyond the edge of vision. Fog pressed low over the swamp that night, curling across water and reeds, settling damp against my coat and hair. The lantern trembled in my hands, pale flame flickering weakly in the thick mist. The air was heavy, wet, carrying the faint tang of rot and mud. Through the fog, I saw it, a cabin. Small, wooden, abandoned, or so it seemed. Its windows glinted faintly in the lantern's glow, dark panes reflecting pale light back at me. Something drew me closer, slow and careful, boots squelching softly in the wet mud. Reeds brushed damp along my arms. Water curled gently at my ankles. The swamp exhaled softly around me, patient, deliberate. I stopped at the edge of the cabin, lantern trembling in my hands. The windows were dark, silent, empty. And then I saw them. Hands, pale, ghostly hands pressed against the glass from the inside. Fingers splayed, thin and long, pressing flat against the wood and glass. The fog curled closer, cold and damp against my face. I whispered softly, "Not real, not real." But the hands did not move. They only pressed, patient, deliberate, against the window. I stepped closer, lantern held high, pale light trembling across the glass. The fog wrapped around my sleeves, pressed damp against my neck. The hands remained, unmoving, yet alive in their presence. I could feel them, patient, watching, aware. A shiver ran through me, damp curling in my hair, mud pressing soft beneath my boots. I whispered again, low and trembling, "Just fog, just swamp, just me." But the fog thickened, curling, along the ground, pressing around my boots, rising to cloud the window. The hands pressed harder, or perhaps I imagined it, my own heartbeat echoing in the mist. The swamp exhaled softly, patient, deliberate, alive. I leaned closer to the glass, trying to see more, to understand. And in the reflection of the lantern I caught movement, shadows shifting beyond the hands, faint and fleeting, like something waiting just beyond perception. I blinked, and the cabin seemed to breathe with the fog. Reeds brushing damp along my arms, water curling at my boots, the air thick with something unseen. Patient, aware. I whispered again, voice barely audible. Not real, not real. The hands pressed harder, pale against the dark glass. Fog thickened, curling low, pressing damp against my face. I could not see through it, I could only feel it. The presence behind the glass, patient, deliberate, impossibly still. I stepped back, lantern shaking, boots sinking soft into the mud. The fog pressed tighter around me, damp along my sleeves, curling into my hair. The hands remained, pressed flat, patient, ghostly in their insistence. I could hear the faintest shift of wood beneath them, subtle, deliberate, like the cabin itself was breathing, alive, aware. The swamp exhaled, curling mist low across water and reeds, pressing damp against my chest. I whispered, trembling, "Just a reflection, just fog, just me." But the fog thickened further, swallowing the lantern's pale glow. The hands pressed harder, or perhaps my mind forced it, pressing the terror into every pulse of my chest, every shiver in my spine, patient, deliberate, unyielding. I stepped back again, careful, boots heavy in the mud. The lantern trembled in my hands, pale flame flickering weakly through the fog. The cabin remained. The hands remained. And the fog thickened further, curling higher until the windows were obscured entirely. I could not see the hands. I could not see the cabin. Only fog. Only wet, patient, curling air pressing damp along my shoulders, my sleeves, my hair. I understood then, with a quiet certainty that chilled every bone in my body. The hands were patient. The presence behind them was aware, and the swamp itself was complicit. I moved slowly, lantern held high, boots heavy with mud, heart hammering softly. The fog pressed low around me, curling over water and reeds, pressing damp along my coat. The cabin vanished, or perhaps I had been swallowed by the fog. The hands were gone, but their presence lingered. Patient, deliberate, unyielding. I whispered, softly to myself as I moved away, careful, slow, every step measured. They are waiting. Always waiting. And I knew with a shiver that the pale hands, pressed flat against the glass, would never truly leave. They would linger in fog and swamp, in every shadow I passed, patient, aware, and impossible to forget. The swamp was thick with fog that night, curling low over water and reeds, pressing damp against my coat and sleeves, lantern trembling in. My hands, boots sinking soft into the mud, I reached a fork in the swamp road. Two paths, splitting into the fog. Both looked familiar, and yet neither seemed right. I stepped forward on the left path. Soft mud pressed against my boots, water curling along the edges. Reeds whispered softly against my arms, damp mist curling into my hair. The fog wrapped around me, patient, deliberate, pressing the air thick and wet. I could feel it shaping the path beneath my feet. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. I came to the fork again, the same two paths, exactly the same, and yet different. The swamp was patient, deliberate, aware. The paths twisted in ways that made no sense. I whispered softly, "Not real, not real." but the fog pressed closer, curling along my sleeves, damp against my neck. The swamp exhaled around me, patient, deliberate, alive. I tried the right path this time, boots pressing into soft mud, water curling at my ankles, lantern trembling in my hands. The path bent slightly, reeds brushing damp along my arms, mist curling low along the water. And then I reached the fork again, the same fork, same paths, same fog curling patient and deliberate. I realized with a shiver curling into my chest that it did not matter which way I chose. The swamp had shaped this. It was aware. It was patient. And I was caught within it. I whispered softly, voice trembling, "Just fog, just reeds, just me." But the swamp did not answer. It only waited. The fog curled thick around my shoulders, pressing damp along my coat. Every movement seemed mirrored. Every step echoed in patterns I could not escape. I tried the left path again. Boots heavy with mud, lantern flickering, heart hammering softly. The swamp exhaled softly, curling fog low over water and reeds, pressing damp along my hair and neck. I reached the fork, the same fork. No difference. A cold certainty pressed into me. The swamp was patient, aware, shaping me, folding me into loops I could not escape. No matter which way I turned, the crossroads remained. The same fork, endless, impossible to leave. I whispered again, soft, trembling, "Not real, not real." The fog pressed closer, curling low around my sleeves, pressing damp along my neck. The swamp exhaled around me, patient, deliberate. Every step I took seemed mirrored. Every movement echoed back, impossible to escape. I stopped, boots pressed into soft mud, lantern trembling in my hands. Reeds brushed damp along my arms, water curled softly at my ankles. The crossroads waited, patient, aware. And I realized I had been here before. I had been here countless times. And I would return. I took a slow breath, lantern held high. Fog curling low around my shoulders. The swamp exhaled gently, pressing, damp along my hair, curling around my sleeves, wrapping the silence tightly around my chest. The crossroads remained. Two paths, endless, and impossible to escape. I whispered softly, voice trembling, "They are waiting, always waiting." The swamp pressed in closer, patient, deliberate, alive. Every choice led back to the same place. Every step folded me deeper into the fog. The crossroads had no end. I moved on slowly, boots heavy, lantern trembling, heart hammering softly. The swamp exhaled around me, curling mist low across water and reeds, pressing damp along my sleeves and neck. The paths shifted subtly beneath my feet, patient and aware. And I understood, with a cold certainty curling into my chest, that I would never leave the crossroads. I would walk them endlessly, step for step, patient, trapped, and unyielding. The swamp was quiet that night, fog curling low over water and reeds, settling damp against my coat and sleeves. The lantern flickered weakly in my hands, pale light trembling against the mist. The air smelled wet, earthy, and heavy, pressing against my chest with every shallow breath. And then I heard it. My name. Soft, gentle, carried through the fog, curling around reeds and water. It was familiar, too familiar. A voice I knew, though I could not place where or when. I froze, boots pressing into wet mud, water curling at my ankles. Reeds brushed damp against my arms. The fog pressed low, curling around my shoulders. I whispered softly, "Not real, not real." But the voice answered again. My name, drawn out, soft, patient. The tone was familiar, almost comforting, and yet wrong. Stretched, hollow, curling through the fog in ways that made the air feel alive. I stepped forward cautiously, lantern held high. Boots squelched softly in the mud, water curling at my ankles. Every step seemed mirrored by the swamp, patient and deliberate. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice trembling. Silence then. My name again. Soft, deliberate, carried through the reeds, echoing off the water. I turned slowly, scanning the fog with trembling eyes. Nothing moved. Nothing. Only mist curling low over water and reeds, thick and patient. I took another step. Boots heavy, lantern trembling, heart hammering softly. The voice followed, curling around the reeds, around the mist, bending the swamp to its rhythm. It called my name again, soft, insistent, familiar. And I realized I had not seen anyone, had not followed anyone. Yet the swamp seemed alive with recognition. I whispered again, soft and low. "Just fog. Just swamp. Just me." The voice answered, almost in sync. My name stretched impossibly long, resonating through the fog, pressing gently but insistently into my chest. I could feel it in my ears, in my bones, in the lantern's trembling light. Patient. Aware. I moved slowly, boots pressing into soft mud, water curling at my ankles. The fog curled around me, pressing damp along my sleeves, settling in my hair. Every step forward made the voice respond, drawing nearer, echoing in places I could not see. I could not locate it. It came from the reeds, from the water, from the air itself. Patient. Deliberate. I stopped. Lantern trembling, pale light weak against the thick fog. The voice called my name softly, gently, impossibly close, yet I saw nothing. Reeds whispered against my arms. Water curled at my boots, mist pressed against my neck. And I understood with a shiver curling into my chest. The swamp knew me. The voice had always known me. It remembered, I whispered softly, trembling. "Not real." "Not real?" But the fog only pressed closer, curling low around my shoulders, damp along my sleeves. The voice answered again, soft, deliberate, curling around the swamp itself. It knew me. Patient, unyielding. I took a careful step forward, boots sinking soft into the mud, lantern held high. The fog shifted, pressing against my face, wrapping around my chest. The voice followed, calling my name gently, familiarly, almost like a whisper in my own mind. The swamp exhaled softly, patient, deliberate, aware. Every step I took was mirrored, every breath measured. I whispered one last time, voice trembling, "Just fog, just swamp, just me." But the voice did not cease. It lingered, curling through the mist, pressing gentle awareness into the swamp around me. And I understood with cold certainty that the voice would follow. Every step, every fog, every movement through reeds and water. Patient, aware, and impossible to ignore. I moved forward slowly, lantern trembling, boots heavy with mud, heart thudding softly. The fog pressed low, curling around me, mist settling damp against my hair and shoulders. The voice followed, soft, deliberate, familiar. And I realized the swamp had always known me, always remembered, patient, unyielding. And I was not alone. The swamp was quiet, fog curling low over water and reeds, settling damp against my coat and sleeves. The lantern trembled in my hands, pale flame flickering weakly through the thick mist. Every step pressed into soft mud, boots sinking slightly, water curling at my ankles. And then I saw it. Not trees, not reeds. A wooden window frame floating in the reflection of the swamp. Glowing faintly, pale light curling across the glass, bending in the fog. I blinked. Boots pressing into soft mud, heart thudding softly. The swamp exhaled gently around me, curling mist low, pressing damp against my shoulders and hair. I stepped closer. Lantern held high, pale flame trembling, casting weak light across the ripples. Water pressed wet against my boots, reeds brushing damp along my arms. The window remained, faintly glowing, edges wavering in the lantern light. I leaned over the water, staring at the reflection. And then I saw it. Something or someone peering back. A shadow, pale, indistinct, shifting behind the glass. The swamp exhaled around me, curling fog low along the water, pressing damp against my chest. I whispered softly, "Not real." Not real? But the figure remained, patient, deliberate, watching. I stepped back, lantern trembling, boots sinking soft into mud. Reeds whispered wet against my sleeves, water curling at my ankles. The window stayed in the reflection, glowing faintly, edges wavering, impossible to touch. I reached toward it. The water rippled, and the shadow drew closer. Heart hammering softly, I whispered again, "Just fog, just swamp, just me." But the reflection answered in its own way, bending in the water, shifting, patient, aware. I could feel it pressing into the swamp itself, every ripple, every droplet vibrating softly in the mist. I stepped closer again. The lantern trembled, pale light stretching across the fog and water. And I saw it more clearly now, a face, a presence, impossible to define. Shadows pressed against the glowing window from the other side. I tried to blink it away. The swamp exhaled gently around me, curling mist low, pressing damp against my shoulders, hair, sleeves, I whispered, low and trembling. Not real. Not real? But the shadow lingered, patient, deliberate, impossible to place. The water rippled under my boots, reeds brushing damp along my arms, fog curling thick around my neck. I could feel it pressing through the reflection, bending light and water, shaping the swamp. Watching. I took a slow step back, boots pressing into soft mud, lantern held high. The shadow followed, shifting, curling in the pale glow of the window. I could not see it directly, only in the water, only in the reflection, only in the soft trembling of the lantern light. The swamp exhaled around me, patient, deliberate, alive. I whispered one last time, voice low and trembling, "Just fog, just swamp, just me." The reflection shimmered, glowing faintly, and the shadow seemed to linger, watching patiently, aware of my every movement. I dared not reach toward it again. I dared not blink. The fog curled thicker, low over the water, pressing damp along my sleeves and shoulders. The lantern flickered, pale light trembling, soft and weak against the mist. The window in the water remained, glowing faintly, impossible to touch. The shadow remained, patient, deliberate, watching. I moved slowly away, boots heavy with mud, lantern trembling, heart thudding softly. The swamp exhaled gently around me, curling low along the water, pressing damp against my hair, my sleeves, my chest. And I knew with quiet certainty that the window and whatever looked back through it would follow me, patient, aware, and impossible to forget. The swamp was quiet that night, fog curling low over water and reeds, pressing damp against my coat and sleeves. The last embers of my campfire glowed faintly, pale orange against the mist, but the flames were weak. No matter how much wood I added, the fire refused to catch, curling low and fading into smoke. I knelt close, lantern trembling in my hands, pale light flickering weakly across wet mud and reeds. The smell of damp wood and fog pressed heavy against my nose. Reeds whispered softly, brushing damp along my arms. The swamp exhaled slowly around me, patient, deliberate, alive. I poked at the fire again, embers glowing briefly, then fading. The flames quivered, sputtering, curling low into smoke. And with every flicker, my courage waned. The swamp pressed closer, fog curling around my shoulders, damp along my hair and sleeves. I whispered softly, "Just fire. Just light. Just me." But the fire had already refused me. I sat back slowly, boots sinking soft into mud, lantern trembling in my hands. Water curled at my ankles, reeds brushing wet against my arms. The fog thickened, curling over the dying fire, pressing low and patient. I could feel it pressing into my chest, shaping the swamp itself around me. Hours, or minutes, passed. The fire burned lower. No crackle, no spark, only faint embers glowing weakly against the darkness. The swamp exhaled softly, mist curling low, pressing damp against my shoulders and hair. I whispered again, soft and trembling. "Not real." "Not real?" But the swamp answered only with silence, patient, deliberate, aware. I leaned back against a log, lantern held high, pale light trembling across mud and reeds. The fire shrank smaller and smaller, curling low into smoke and ash. The fog pressed closer, damp along my sleeves, curling into my hair. Every shadow seemed alive, moving in slow, deliberate patterns across the mist. I tried to relight the fire once more. A spark, a faint flame, but it flickered, sputtered, and vanished. The swamp exhaled, curling low around my boots, pressing damp along my chest. I whispered softly, "Just wood. Just fire. Just me." But the fire refused again. The last campfire was gone. I sat in silence, listening to the swamp. Water rippling softly along mud channels, reeds brushing wet against each other, mist curling around my shoulders. The fog pressed thick, patient, deliberate. Every step I had taken, every breath, every heartbeat, folded into the swamp itself, and the absence of fire felt heavier than any sound, colder than any shadow. I moved slowly, boots heavy in mud, lantern trembling, pale light weak against the thick fog. The swamp exhaled softly, curling mist low, pressing damp along my sleeves, hair, chest. Every step echoed in soft, deliberate patterns. I whispered one last time, voice low and trembling, "They are patient." Always patient. The fire was gone. The smoke vanished. Only fog, reeds, water, and the swamp remained, patient and deliberate, alive in its quiet. The absence of light pressed into my chest, curling around my heart, shaping every pulse, every breath. I could not escape it. I could not will it back. I leaned against a log, lantern weak in my hands, boots sunk into soft mud. The swamp exhaled around me, curling low, damp along my sleeves, settling into my hair. The last campfire had died, leaving only silence. And I realized that in the quiet, in the absence, the swamp itself was the only presence. Patient, deliberate, unyielding. I whispered softly, voice trembling, "Just swamp. Just fog. Just me." The fog curled closer, pressing damp around my shoulders, into my sleeves, against my neck. The swamp exhaled gently, patient, deliberate, aware, and I knew, with cold certainty, that the absence of fire would follow me forever. Step for step, breath for breath, patient, unyielding. I moved slowly through the reeds, lantern trembling, boots heavy with mud, heart beating softly in the silence. The swamp breathed around me. The last campfire was gone, and in its place, only patient, deliberate fog. The swamp exhaled that night, slowly, patiently. A fog rolled low over water and reeds, curling along my boots, pressing damp against my sleeves and hair. The lantern trembled weakly in my hands, pale light quivering against the thick mist. At first, I thought it was just the fog, just the swamp breathing in its usual quiet rhythm. But the more I watched, the more I realized it was alive. The fog rose and fell, curling around reeds, stretching across water, pulsing in and out like lungs. I knelt by the water, boots soft in mud, water curling gently at my ankles. The swamp inhaled, exhaled. I could feel it pressing, shaping itself around me, patient, deliberate, aware. Every ripple, every curl of fog, every brush of reeds against my arms was part of its breath. I whispered softly, voice trembling, "Just fog. Just swamp, just me." But the swamp answered in its own way, a pulse beneath my feet, wet mud shifting softly, water rippling gently, brushing my boots, reeds shivering as if alive. I rose slowly, lantern trembling in my hands, pale light weak against the fog. The swamp inhaled again, curling low around my shoulders, pressing damp into my hair, my sleeves, my chest. I could feel it in my lungs, in my heartbeat, in the soft tremor of my fingers holding the lantern. It was patient, deliberate, unyielding. I moved carefully, boots pressing into soft mud, water curling around my ankles. The fog followed, curling low over the path I had made. Every step pressed into the swamp's rhythm, echoing in its pulse. I whispered again, voice low and trembling, "Not real, not real." But the swamp exhaled around me, patient, deliberate, alive. Every step I took became part of it. Every breath I drew synced with its pulse. The reeds brushed wet against my arms. The water rippled gently. The fog pressed thick and damp against my neck. I understood with a chill curling through my chest that I was no longer separate. The swamp breathed with me, and I breathed with it. I knelt by the water again, watching the fog pulse over the surface. It rose, fell, curled low over the reeds, lifted. I could feel it shaping itself around my chest, my shoulders, my lungs. Patient, aware, alive. I whispered softly, almost a prayer. Just fog. Just swamp, just me. And yet I could not escape it. I could not leave it behind. The swamp exhaled gently, curling around me, pressing damp along my hair, sleeves, chest. It inhaled. It exhaled. And I understood. I had always been part of it. The lantern trembled in my hands, pale light quivering weakly against thick fog. Every shadow seemed alive. Every ripple in the water echoed through the swamp itself. Every breath I took pressed into its rhythm, sinking, folding me into its pulse. Patient. Deliberate. I moved slowly along the water's edge, boots heavy with mud, heart hammering softly. The fog curled low around my shoulders, pressing damp into my sleeves and hair. The swamp breathed with me, and I breathed with it. It was patient, unyielding, eternal. I whispered softly one last time, voice trembling. Just swamp. Just fog. Just me. And the swamp exhaled around me. It pressed low against the water, reeds brushing damp along my arms, fog curling tight around my chest. It inhaled, exhaled, patient, alive, and I realized I would never leave. The swamp had been alive all along. Every fog curl, every ripple in water, every shiver of reeds, every soft exhale of mist, it had been breathing, patiently, deliberately, and I had walked inside its lungs. Every breath I drew, every step I took folded me into it. I knelt by the water once more, boots pressing into soft mud, lantern trembling in my hands. The fog rose and fell, pulled in, released, and I understood. To breathe with it meant to stay, forever, patient, deliberate, unyielding. The swamp exhaled again, curling low over water and reeds, pressing damp against my shoulders, my sleeves, my chest. I whispered softly, voice trembling, I am part of you. I breathe with you. And the fog rose higher, curling around my head, my hair, pressing soft and wet against my cheeks. The lantern flickered weakly. The reeds shivered. The water rippled, and I breathed with the swamp, patient, alive, forever.